talking about walk-ins, and I guess you know, I was thinking this morning, if you told me 20 years ago I'd be sitting here talking about walk-ins, I just would have gone, nah, what? But it's amazing how your mind can open up to different ideas, you know, different concepts over the years. One leads to another, and I've been hearing from a couple of you, different books that you've had and how they lead you on from one thing to another, which is the way it goes and which is the way creativity works. So, what are they? Walk-ins are higher-minded entities permitted to take over the bodies of human beings who wish to depart this life. And that can be generally, and look, what I'm going to talk about today is my own research. It's not, I'm not going to say there's a reality in this, I'm not going to say there's not a reality in it, okay? But it's something to consider. And I think if you're investigating the afterlife and you accept that we have a soul or a spirit, call it what you like, and that our existence is, you know, one of longevity, not just of this life, and I think that it's, you know, it's important to make room in our minds for these other ideas, which for me is, you know, still borderline, but I'm sort of looking at it and going, I could see how it would be sensible to do something like this from a practical point of view. But yes, we will see. So generally, they're considered to be higher-minded entities. They'll come here for, they will take over someone else's body for specific purposes. If someone is experiencing depression and they're approaching quickly to suicide, they don't want to be here anymore, from my understanding is that another soul will come and enter their body. There may be a specific purpose, there's a mission that they've got, which we'll talk about later with an extraterrestrial case here in Australia, which is quite obscure but very interesting. And you know, there can be, they can actually also come into the body close to death as well, to add energy to that body and actually help them recover, so they can be permanent or temporary as well, which I find very interesting too. So, but if you think about it, we're all walk-ins at birth, really. If you accept that we have a soul, let's call it a soul, and we incarnate, then we're all walking into a physical form at birth. Or some aren't. It's very quick and they're out again. So I wonder, do they sort of hand-me-down body? Do we have hand-me-down bodies, or is it possible to have that? It's not the idea of a walk-in is not new. Apparently in Sanskrit, which I don't know, dates back to whenever, they refer to body change. In Hindu, they have and Mahayana Buddhism. I don't know about the Theravadan Buddhism, but they call them bodhisattvas. My understanding had been that there are bodhisattvas who keep incarnating to help humanity raise itself to its next level of development, and they can do this by acting as a walk-in as well. From my understanding, and maybe you can set me straight, Andrew, you were talking about this before, the Mahayana and the Theravadan, two different traditions. I think the Mahayana... Yeah,
one's in and one's out.
Yeah.
So Mahayana is esoteric, and it's about compassionate bodhisattva, and it's about helping others. Their mission is to help other suffering beings to be able to teach them or show an example on how to raise their vibration and to be compassionate and kind towards other human beings. The Theravada Buddhism, which is more in Thailand and areas like that, is more inwards, where they work on themselves and they isolate themselves from other human beings to work on themselves to elevate. So there's an inward and an outward one, and there's not a lot of Mahayana Buddhism schools out there. Theravada seems to be where you see the Buddhist monks in their orange robes and things like that. They're the Theravada Buddhism.
Yeah.
So the Mahayana is more with came from China to Korea to Japan. So it's more that area of the world over the last couple of thousand years.
I've heard it explained as well that the Mahayanas, they want everyone to come up to reach nirvana, whereas and they won't go there themselves until everyone can go with them, and then the Mahayanas and the Theravadins, they will go there, reach nirvana and come back and educate other people about where they can go. That was another way I heard it explained to me too, sort of, I guess. Yeah, different approach.
Different approach, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I believe you've got the choice once you're up there whether you want to become a master or and help people to write their what they need to do before the soul comes down to earth. They also believe that every human being has a Buddha nature or a soul, or they may decide to help others up there and stay up there. So it just depends where you are in the reincarnation.
In the cycle.
So each particular person and soul will be different on what they choose to do. Some will come back and some won't, but all will participate in helping others. It just depends where.
Yeah, or if they've had the coffee, I don't know. Like me. Okay, so but in our modern New Age world, we call them walk-ins or soul exchange, and some of you would have heard about the dual soul connection too. We've got Susie Hansen in New Zealand who talks about her experience of that. Also in Brisbane, there's Judy Carroll who talks about that. Both have written books about those experiences. Again, they can be temporary or permanent. So, and walk-ins can come from the same soul group or star family. Soul exchanges between two unrelated beings as well, which I think is the case in the case I'm going to talk about later. Or different soul groups or star or planetary origins. And they can also have a shared body experience too. So I've been reading about cases where there'll be some sort of agreement at some stage in the existence of the soul here on Earth where another soul can come in and they will manage one body between the two. Again, going back to that dual soul connection, but except in the case of Judy and Susie, it's an extraterrestrial soul.
Are they both in the body at the same time, or do they keep exchanging?
No, well, both, I think. Yeah, both. Which is interesting. I mean, that would just confuse the hell out of yourself, wouldn't it? Like,
isn't it hard enough figuring out which way's pointing up at the moment?
Are my thoughts my own, or something else?
Exactly.
So would that be someone that may be experiencing schizophrenia?
Say again,
So
sorry?
could schizophrenia be a symptom of that?
Well, I'm going to get on to that, but yeah, it could be. Yeah, because it depends on the culture, actually, Diane, because in some cultures, like if I've got a book upstairs called, just about shamans in different cultures, and when the Westerners came upon them, they found them to have a lot of schizoid tendencies, and they thought they were schizophrenic. And maybe they were, and maybe they weren't, but because they could communicate between worlds and they would have experiences and messages from other beings, of course our Western science would go, hey, you're a schizophrenic, or you've got some sort of psychosis going on anyway. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about William James, who was the father of American psychology, but I call him a mystic scientist because he explored a lot of alternative ideas. And he played a key role in establishing psychology as a science, if you could call it that. And I'm an empirical discipline, let's call it that. And I've heard various people talk about psychology as not a science, but an art form or a skill. And maybe it is, and maybe it's all the above, who knows. Getting to know how people tick and what's going on inside of them is not easy, is it? And why are they that happens to them and that happens to them differently, very different. But he was also the founding member and vice president of the American Society for Psychical Research. And he defended unorthodox forms of healing, denounced mainstream medicine and science as short-sighted, advocated a whole new pathway to knowledge, and wanted to embrace both mysticism and science. Let's go back. 1842 to 1910.
Wow.
So he was popular initially,
Yeah.
but then my understanding is he very quickly lost popularity after, defending lots of paranormal, psychic, and I wouldn't. And he was, from what I've read, he wasn't saying that they're all real, but he was saying that science was just short-sighted and it needed to look more deeply into what was going on. And I think if he was alive today, I'd like to meet him and get to know him. Because when I was reading a lot more about him, I just thought, this is someone I think would have been on my sort of wavelength, or our wavelength, There's a great book by, it's called War of the World Views, with Deepak Chopra and a scientist, I can't remember. So Deepak Chopra represents the mystical side of things, even though he's a doctor himself, and the other scientist is the empirical person. And they both put together, I think they write, they write one after the other in each chapter about certain things. It's an interesting book to get. So here he is, 1885, sitting with medium Leonora Piper, who, by the way, became quite famous because of her connection to him. And that was 1 year after the death of his young son. So I guess that was the catalyst, or probably even propelled him further or more strongly to look at other things, I'd say. And I don't blame him. I don't blame him. But he desired to build a comprehensive psychology of the human unconscious. And he said multiple personality disorder is something natural but not yet understood, and not particularly a mental disease. Now, that doesn't mean he was right, and it doesn't mean he was wrong. It just means he had a different view to what the other scientists, if you call them that, at the time. I like this particular one because, we know the conscious mind was aware of this much. Our unconscious is huge. And then we've got this boundless consciousness, which we all tap into. I think I call it the World Wide Web of consciousness, or Barry's famous term, quantum consciousness, which I've heard from other people too. So, and I do think that we can tap into that and use those pathways in quantum consciousness to communicate with lots of different beings, and not necessarily just on planet Earth. And I just really liked him because as a true scientist, he wasn't afraid to explore more widely. I think I just love to see more scientists doing that these days. They say they do, but when I've looked at it, they actually don't, from my perspective. And I'm looking at that from the UFO subject, and looking at the psychology of people who've had report close encounters, and I've spoken to many of those, and we had people like Dr. John Mack, who was a Harvard psychiatrist, and was he a psychologist too? And he didn't find any sort of mental health issues, with those people. So, but anyway, those people are few and far between. So, let me tell you the story about Saint Tirumula. But this is the most famous Hindu story of a walk-in from the 6th century. And legend has it that he voluntarily left his body in order to reanimate a young cowherd who had just died. And he had the ability to vacate his body at will, so Tirumula left his own body safely tucked away in a log to enter the cowherder's body to save him from a possible fatal situation. And when Tirumula returned to where his body was, it was gone. And he was told by the god Siva that it was helpful for him to remain in the cowherder's body because he was able to access the dead man's knowledge. The man also spoke Tamil, which was very important. Don't ask me how it all works. I don't know. I'm just telling you the story. and his own body was subsequently taken to heaven, leaving him to spend the remainder of his life on earth in the body of the cowherd, and presumably to help the people that he'd been sent there to help on a mission, basically, or some the god Shiva had a mission for him. Okay. Then we have Devrah Baba, who supposedly shared a body. Now, I never heard of this guy. Have you heard of him? He died in 1990.
No.
Never heard of a peep about him. It was very interesting. So it's said that after his death in 1990, the soul of Devrah Baba, often described as an ageless yogi and unusual hermit, who was popular amongst both common people and the most powerful people, would speak through the living body of his successor, who was Babe Sarkar. And it seemed that he shared Sarkar's body with him in a dual soul situation, which is interesting in itself. But apparently he lived on this 12-foot high wooden platform near the river and wore a small deer skin, and a barricade of wooden planks hid his semi-naked body from his devotees, and he came down only to bathe in the river. Interesting. But he had this supposedly a dual soul situation going on. It's believed that he lived up to the age of 250 years and never ate anything. Yes, so interesting, because just going on with the age of him, of what is reported, there were thousands of followers, including someone surnamed Vajpayee, a staunch devotee who later became India's Prime Minister from 1998 to 2004. He was at his funeral and to bid him adieu to the other side, but he was a staunch follower. Also, this guy, Rajendra Prasad, who was India's first president from 1950 to 62, and he stated that his father had sat at the feet of Devrah Baba as a child in the middle of the 19th century, and Baba was already elderly at the time. Wow. Make of that what you will. I don't know. There's a lot of interesting things go on in those eastern countries. A lot of interesting reports. I would like to... I'd love to know if that was true. Oh, I'm thinking of a man who also claimed he didn't eat, and he was actually put into a lab and studied for quite a long time, and he didn't eat. And I don't think he even urinated, didn't drink. So there's a lot of those strange stories, unusual stories, which we don't seem to have that what's the word I want to say? Legacy in this country.
Too young.
Yeah, too young.
Aboriginals
Too
possibly
young.
do.
Yeah, they might, yeah. Okay. So, walk-in checklist. Apparently, after people have these experiences, they can have name and career changes, they can have dietary changes, sudden onset of allergic reactions, memory loss about parts of one's life. Of course, that can always happen with trauma too, in childhood, things like that. Some desire to move to a new environment, feels that one is not really from Earth. Who feels like that? They think and feel differently and believe different things about the world and themselves from previously. New interest in the study of psychic phenomena, not perfect but more spiritual, compassionate and sympathetic. Often the firstborn child. Karen. Tick, 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 tick.
I know.
And they can walk out as well. So you have to make some sort of, first of all, communication with, you know, the greater power, and then really call that in and say, hey, I've had enough of this, I want to go somewhere else. Apparently it can take weeks or months to reach realisation for some walk-ins, and there's a story I'm going to tell you about that Australian walk-in who he didn't realise really until he was around 30 that he really wasn't from here at all.
Wow.
Yeah, had a realisation. Took a long time. Occasionally the old self returns months or years later and the new self departs. They can coexist or integrate into a single being or cooperate to live as two persons in one body, which we touched on before. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
If that was a reality, like, wow, coming to terms with all that. She wrote 17 books in all, usually about the paranormal, well, all about the paranormal. But she started off her career as a journalist and a political columnist. And that was how she sort of became known. Then she got interested in all this stuff, because apparently she discovered she had guides who would communicate with her too, which is interesting. But she was a prolific writer on the subject of clairvoyance and reincarnation, past life regression, psychic phenomena and clandestine extraterrestrials. And she wrote a book called, was it Aliens Among Us as well?
She has that one too, yes.
Yeah,
Aliens
I've got
Among
that
Us.
one too, yeah.
Right after that one.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting books, very interesting. So she published this one in 79, and she brought in so doing, she brought the concept of aliens to the public, you know, to the fore for the public. And then, of course, you know, people started contacting her about this, and she interviewed a few of those people and found them very interesting, some of them. But of course, from that time, this whole New Age belief system around walk-ins sort of blew out of proportion too. Now you've got, you know, like we've said before, walk-ins who are channelers and having, you know, 24/7 contact with aliens, and, you know, like, and I'm not saying that's not happening, but I'm just saying it's, if you're looking on the internet for walk-ins, there's a lot to me that just sounds like a lot of bunk, really. Mm-hmm. But there are some, if you go through that, you can find these nuggets of gold in there of people talking about their experiences, and not necessarily in a way that's very egotistical either. But, you know, that's my experience. As of 2006, an increasing number of people claim some type of walk-in experience. Okay, so Ruth Montgomery believed that these people were influential walk-ins in history. So you've got Gandhi, Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, Emanuel Swedenborg, Meister Eckhart, Shankara, never heard of, but you have, haven't you? Leading exponent of Advaita Vedanta, consciousness underlies all objects and experiences, which is basically consciousness, quantum consciousness, right? And then Joseph, who interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh and rose to become quite a famous wise governor, which is an interesting thought as well. So, you know, I can see how it would be sensible for souls to walk into bodies where they could have some sort of influence and create a larger circle of influence around themselves too. So when they occur is when a terminal patient's in a coma or operation and they miraculously survive. So this person is just not expected to survive, but lo and behold, they're alive. And then they're completely different people. So, you know, the idea is that a walk-in has come in there. Anesthesia for surgery, which can go wrong, is apparently a common trigger, which is interesting. I've come up a few times in what I was reading. During near-death experiences, that seems to make sense to me, where, you know, people are in this altered state of consciousness in a different realm. The body's vacated. Perhaps, I mean, I haven't really heard about people having near-death experiences. Well, you wouldn't, because they go on to somewhere else and another soul comes and goes into their body. So that first soul has gone, so they're not going to write about it, and I don't know whether the walk-in would write about it either. I really don't know. I haven't heard that really much. Motor vehicle accident, birth. You know, I have read stories of people who have memories of coming into a baby's body. They had memories before they were born, then they came into the baby's body and a soul left that baby's form and they came in and took it over. I have read that, when the baby actually died, but there was a body, and yeah, and don't ask me how it all works. Some sort of mechanism in play there. Depression, when, like I was saying before, people have just had enough, they just can't get out of that hole. Suicide, again, it can happen when they actually die, but the soul comes in and takes over. Desire for temporary respite from human life. And so that's where you can have that temporary experience, okay, apparently, okay. And during recuperation, you have a guest walk in while you're actually feeling much better over time. Interesting. Let's talk about, just quickly, about other kin.
Yes, other kin.
Who are people who identify as angels and aliens or sprites, elves, mermaids, or creatures from the natural world. Yeah. And I've actually met people, you know, it's a really interesting thing that, I'm just looking at this one too though, but people I've met over the years get really involved in something. And I've got a friend who I'm now, who lives in New South Wales, between New South Wales and Victoria, and she got very much into fairies. And if you look at her for a long time, and if you look at her, she looks like one of the what was it, the elves out of
Yes. She's elven.
Yes.
Lord of the Rings.
What is it?
Elfin.
Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, but who said elf? Elfin. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Because she's got the long blonde hair, very tall, slim, and she was just so much into these fairies for years and years and years and years. And I thought, gosh, she's sort of embodying that sort of spirit, you know, but that's how she looks as well. Those of you who've have a power animal too, or totem animal, you might relate to this as well. You can embody the energy and the physical nature of those particular animals. And because of Walkins, it made me wonder about this. So I just sort of throw it in, because I thought, you know, there are so many different ways that we could embody energy and spirits, those sorts of things. And when I talk about like creatures from the natural world and sprites and elves and, you know, forest divas and all those, it's like that enters our energy field, you know, and we can sort of take that on too. Because my only power animal at this stage is a deer, and so I'm a really swift person, swift-minded, and sort of like looking alert, yeah, those sorts of things. Like I have a lot of those deer qualities about me. So yeah, I just wanted to put that in there. Something else to think about. So let's talk about extraterrestrial Walkins.
Oh, goody.
I've had the food. This is what I came for.
Oh, I was a fairy once too.
What have you done with Karen? Karen doesn't say, oh, goody.
No, she goes, oh dear. Anyway, so the case I wanted to talk about, one of them is Jules Verne. And I've probably mentioned him at various times. I've got this book. I don't think it's on Audible, Karen. But have a look.
I'm putting it in my notes.
It's a very obscure book. If you can find it, you'd be lucky, I think.
Have you got it?
I've got it. Yeah. I didn't know I had it for a long time, but then I read it years ago. Yeah. So it's called The Secret Life of a Space Incarnate. And he was a real person who lived down near in the Blue Mountains in Katoomba, wasn't it, Azza? He lived in Katoomba, I think, yes. Yes, because his wife's still there. And we know a UFO researcher who knows his wife. So the story goes, and this is the only book that he's ever written as far as I know. It's a very interesting book, and he came to Earth in the 1930s, incarnating in the body of an 8-year-old Swedish boy who was dying from double pneumonia. And at the time of his transference, he was a member of a space expedition from another planet, which was coming here to offer astro-scientific help to Earth. And he had a very difficult early life. And I think because of that, it took him a long time to come to the realisation of that he wasn't actually, to remember that he'd actually stepped into this boy's body. And it was a really tough childhood. He had a choice. There were 4 candidate bodies that he could choose from, one in England, Australia, Sweden and the US. But he chose the Swedish body because he thought that it has the least... it avoided the fetters of social chains like race, status, religious views, political issues, you know, all those sort of things, etc. So, he left his physical. Jules himself actually claimed to have come here on a spaceship, on a physical spaceship, And when he left the body on the ship, it was to be taken somewhere else and be put into stasis until his mission was finished. Yes?
What planet was it from? Do you know?
What planet? Mikal. Mykal. That's what he called it. Now, whether it was something that we called it something else, I don't know. Mikal. He says, when it came time for him to shift, he says, I felt my consciousness slip and a brilliant spark began to spin around the centre of my awareness. A falling sensation took hold of me as I moved through a tube of light, and the face of my old teacher and friend flashed across my vision. There were some amplified sensations and sounds of rushing waters, then a feeling of discomfort, and after that a great stillness enfolded me, and I stayed in this state for an unknown time. When he came to, he felt very strange, and he had the intuition that something of great magnitude had occurred. And the first thing he heard was a woman saying, "It's a miracle," and a doctor saying, "No, it's the latest in medicine."
Typical.
What?
It's the latest in medicine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's having some drug to help him. Mind you, again, this is 1930s. I don't know what they would have. Well, yeah, things they gave him. Okay. So the interesting thing is that during his convalescence, gone were the nightmarish dreams of childhood where he was being chased by monsters, and he said he had strange memories of sitting with elders in conversation. And he says it was a difficult time because he'd incarnated in the 1930s with his father away and his mother had been sent to the poorhouse, and eventually he found himself living on a farm being exploited to work hard. Now his mission, the story goes that there were 5 of them who came together. I forget what they call them, like a spectre or anyway, there was a group of 5 people, and that there was him and I think it was his a female friend, not his partner though, and 3 others. The first 2 were he was contacted telepathically. He then spoke to his friend about it, who was also interested in flying saucers in those days, they were called, and extraterrestrial life. Then they decided on who else they would ask to join the mission, join the group, and then over time he was actually telepathically communicated with by these extraterrestrials and told of his mission, which was basically to be aware of the serpent race of Orion, apparently. And apparently they were about to cause Earth a lot of problems. Now that was the 1930s, and by the 1960s, but before that, but by the 1960s we started hearing about alien abduction experiences. And the 1990s it was through the roof.
Yes.
So, and the little greys, I think initially when we first started in the 80s I was hearing about that, they were said to be from Orion, from the star system of Orion, which is interesting in itself. So I don't know, put that together how you will. But anyway, he eventually, I think he died in his 90s, and by the way, his mission was like just about a 3-year mission as an adult, and then he stayed here. He ended up deciding to stay here. And when Barry and I were down in Sydney at an investigator training course, I think it was it Bassa? Where we were having lunch, and then the fellow sitting across the table from us was saying that he had been he'd been to Yule's place, he'd met him while he was still alive. After he died, he wanted to get all of Yule's papers. I don't know whether the wife was going to throw them out, but he wanted to get them before she did. All the things that he wrote down, all the communications that he'd recorded, etc., etc. But anyway, now my memory is he died under unusual circumstances, in that I'm sure that guy said that there were footprints found going out into the bushland, and I've got this idea, I don't know where it came from, and his body was found outside. I don't know, but it was something a bit unusual about it, you know. So, but that could be, I could be getting cases confused, I don't know. Yeah, so that's an interesting story. If you can get it, it's worth reading, that's for sure. And about the last third of it is full of his spiritual understandings, basically, too. But the first lot talks about his story. The next story is of this woman, Charlotte King, who's a human seismograph. She's in her 70s now, she's still alive, in California. and she's able to predict impending earthquakes and volcanic eruptions.
Wow. Well, she's in the right place.
Yeah. That's true. That's very true. Yeah. She can specify the time of the disaster and pinpoint the locale, and more accurately than any other advanced scientific equipment.
Wow. Yeah.
And apparently there are about 60 people on the planet who have this ability. I didn't know that. I didn't know there were 60 people. Like I thought, well, I understand that animals, you know, they know these sorts of things. Yeah. But I didn't realise that it makes sense, of course. And when now I think about it, I was saying to Barry the other day that contactee from around the 30s or 40s, maybe one of you know, Orfeo Angelucci. He was also used to get terrible migraines before a thunderstorm would come.
Yeah.
So he was picking up on that as well. Oh, by the way, also she's predicted the exact dates and time of all the Mount St. Helens eruptions, as well as 300 California earthquakes since 1979. And that information that I'm getting that from was like 10 years old. And government records show that her predictions have 85% accuracy on earthquakes and 100% on volcanic activity work. Wow. So you could see why they would be very interested in people like her.
Yes.
And actually, there's something called the Charlotte King effect that has become known by science, apparently, by some scientists. That's what they call it, that people who can pick this stuff up as well. She'll hear sounds, so she hears a sound like a foghorn sound, and it's just like, it goes on and on and on and on and on, it drives it crazy, at a very low resonance that other people don't hear it. She can get migraines, she was actually hospitalised once and went into intensive care, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Anyway, the scientists have concluded that she hears a very low frequency range, and a few days before earthquakes and volcanic eruptions occur, she hears sounds, feels pain is the other thing too. The sounds cause migraines, and like I said, she's been hospitalised quite a lot due to the severity of her actions. Now, in 1976, she found herself jobless and separated from her husband and feeling a lot of emotional and physical stress, so she tried to kill herself. I mean, who wouldn't, hearing all that all the time? And she did it by gulping down wine, followed by taking half a bottle of painkillers. She wanted out, and to end the emotional and physical pain caused by the constant foghorn sounds that she was hearing. She ended up spending 16 hours in intensive care, and when she woke up she was completely changed. Completely. She no longer wanted to die. She knew she had a job to do, that her kids needed her, and that she could save her marriage. And it was during her time in hospital that the old Charlotte departed and a new replacement from Sirius stepped in, she says.
Wow.
The Walkins Charlotte went on to investigate the causes of sound and pain that caused her distress, which became known as the Charlotte King effect, and became the prime subject of an ongoing study called Project Migraine. Now, curiously, Charlotte saw her first UFO with the family in 1959 near Salem in Oregon. She said she doesn't have a lot of memory, but her parents told her that this UFO kept pace with the vehicle for a long time. And there were other reports at the airport. The airport picked it up, but they didn't know what it was at that time. So, but that's her story around her and about her walk-in experience, where she claims it was from Sirius. There you go. This is David Paladin. This is another interesting case too. He was a noted artist who lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He was born on a Navajo reservation in Arizona. He was the son of a white missionary father and a Navajo Indian mother. And as a child, he kept running away until the outbreak of World War II, when basically he was hustled into uniform, given some training in cartography, and shipped to Europe with the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which is the forerunner of the CIA. Anyway, in Germany, while mapping installations behind enemy lines, he was captured and thrown into a Nazi prison camp where he was grilled, beaten, starved and left for dead by the retreating Germans. The advancing British troops found 120 abandoned bodies and tossed them into a boxcar for removal from Germany for burial. But in searching them for identification, they noticed a faint stir of life in one of them, which was him.
Wow.
So as a spy for the US, David had worn a German uniform without identification. And after being sent to a British field hospital in Vienna, Austria, he remained in a deep coma. Now, in this coma, he occasionally spoke in Russian. He would mumble a few things. So because of that, he was then transported to a hospital for Eastern European refugees, where he remained until fingerprints eventually identified him as one of those missing presumed dead American soldiers. Still in a coma, he was sent poor bugger. He was sent to an Army Transport Hospital in Battle Creek in Michigan, where after 2.5 years he later regained consciousness.
Gee, thank God they didn't pull the plug.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean,
They like to do today.
yeah, exactly. Anyway, asked his name, he replied, "I'm an artist, and my name is Vasily
Oh, really?
Kandinsky." Okay, right? Okay, but his fingerprints identified him as David Paladin, and Kandinsky, the Russian artist he named, had died in France at the age of 78 in 1944 when David was 18. So, to complicate matters more, as David became more alert, he admitted he never heard of Kandinsky and knew no Russian until he heard himself speaking it.
Seriously?
So anyway, he asked the Red Cross for some art supplies, and he painted abstract art pieces that caught the attention of the art world because Kandinsky was an abstract artist.
Yes,
In fact, he made abstract art famous. Turns out that David Paladin later reported to Ruth Montgomery that he'd had contact with space beings, and so he had his 4-year-old son, who was having contact with a person called Itan, I-T-A-N, who came into the house and took him into a big sky car, which the son claimed had landed behind their house in Prescott, Arizona. Now, the boy said that he went to a place where Earth looked like a little dot. They then brought him home and went into the garage where they milked the truck. This is what the son said. Milked the truck that David's neighbour had parked there. Turns out the milking was actually the removal of the oil from the engine. But David and his neighbour, although they found the oil plug, there were no drips on the ground or anything like that. But the oil was just gone. So initially David paid little attention to his son's story, as you do. If you're a kid, you think, oh, he's just making this up, what's going on? Until his neighbour, who was a forest ranger, told him that he'd seen a flying saucer hovering over the area the night before. Now, he'd also seen David's son accompanied by a tall, thin man dressed in white overalls, walking towards a strange greenish light in the rocky area behind David's house. The neighbour called out to them, but then seemed to forget until the next morning when he saw David emptying the garbage the next morning. So, 2 months later, David woke up to see a tall, thin humanoid form standing at the end of his bed, and the being appeared to be wearing a one-piece silver-white jumpsuit. And David sat up to make certain that he was awake. And the being identified himself as his son's friend Itan, and told David that he and his friends were from another planet that existed in another dimension, and that they had visited Earth for centuries and had attempted to make contact with humans, but found most of them manipulative and selfish, causing his group to limit their visits. So I wanted to include that alien part because it has come up in quite a few cases that I've read, that people who have had alien contact and also have walk-in experiences. So I'm sort of starting to wonder, you know, and then you've got Susie Hanson's story of the dual soul connection and Judy Carroll, the dual soul. I'm starting to think, you know, because I personally think that there is a connection, definitely a connection between close encounter experiences and the afterlife. So it's not a big jump for me to go to, you know, walk-ins as well. And I have read cases where in C.D. Bryant's book, I think it is, Close Encounters, where there are people who have said that while they're having close encounter experiences, that these aliens have catalysed out-of-body experiences in the humans too. So I think that these aliens, or some of them, certainly understand us, you know, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and can manipulate that if they want to, or can utilise that to advantage, or positive advantage too. I just don't know, or all of the above. So yeah, I find it very interesting. But back to David, yes. So Here's David's artwork that he's done, which is interesting in itself.
Yes.
And there's Kandinsky's.
Yeah.
Right? Go back to David's. That's just a couple that I pulled out. And then I mean, abstract art to me is just all abstract. I don't, you know, I go, oh, no, I'd never paint that. That's not art. But, you know, some people who are in the art world go, wow, that's amazing. And to think that this guy, Kandinsky, was, like, really famous because of his artwork.
Yeah.
But there's the critics said that David's work was far better. They thought it was far better as an abstract artist. Now, this is a story I want to tell you of someone that I know personally and have known for a long time. Just call him Carl. And he came to us, oh gosh, he was 18 at the time I first met him, and he's now nearly 50, I think, something like that. Yeah, it'd be about right. Or at least 45. And so he came and he reported UFO sightings to us, and he had this strange experience he wanted to share, which he did with me privately initially. And then later on, as he grew more confident, he actually did it at one of our one-day seminars back in '97, I think it was. So, leading up to this particular event, he began to have strange dreams. And I had to, because I documented it, so I'm going to have to read it to you, because I can't remember it all, but I want you to know everything. Where he'd wake up in the middle of the night, walk to the backyard, go through a paddock and into bushland. And in one of those dreams, he was standing on the island in the middle of the creek with a shaft of blue light as well as smaller lights buzzing around it. And the blue light would change into people's faces, and at one stage he was met with a reflection of his own face. This is a dream, okay? Another year later, he began having a recurring dream, another one where he'd be flying and see a flawless white dome among the clouds. A few months later, he had another recurring dream where he'd see a transparent tower made of something resembling crystal, and while looking at the tower he saw a huge comet fly by. Another year goes by and now he's 12 years old. Okay. His family emigrates to another country, and within a month their family life became quite traumatic. And it's during this time that Carl started to feel detached and very withdrawn, and he stopped speaking. And one particular event, he went to bed, and the next day he woke up and found that he was not himself anymore. But at the time he didn't realise it, which is interesting. Okay, he found himself in another world, populated by beings who were very tall, had a slightly feline appearance with high cheekbones, slightly tapered eyes, and long flowing hair ranging in colour from green, red, brown and blonde. This world was governed by 3 suns and 3 moons, and its inhabitants appeared to be living in a golden age with a utopian society in place. And Carl described himself as having black hair, green eyes and olive skin, and his age was equivalent to that of about 300 Earth years. He described the people he knew as Aknars, A-K-N-A-R-S, as very spiritual but high-tech, and they'd managed to integrate their spirituality with their technology very successfully. And although there were no appliances in the world as we know them, the Aknars made great use of crystals for storage of information. Once programmed, the crystals would be used to levitate in the air and act as lights or enhance telepathic communication. And they are aware of the ability to manipulate energy fields to create matter, and in doing so practiced the understanding that energy is the basis for all material existence. People who had developed these abilities passed that of the general society were the scientists and spiritual leaders. And although high-tech, this society still used animals for local transport, as they had developed a working relationship with them, and the animals would happily cooperate in their relationship. Now, however, when the Aknars wanted to travel great distances, they had the ability to travel to other worlds using gateways that they created at will by stretching time and space. The Aknars shared their world with humans, but this cohabitation was not harmonious. And the humans were quite jealous of the Aknars' abilities, and Carl felt that they broadcast a very strong negative energy towards the Aknars. The humans of this world were equivalent to those who existed in our medieval period, and didn't share the same understanding of their connection to the universe as the Aknar people did. And Carl also felt that there was something in the air that suggested that the harmonious life of the Aknars and the balance they actively sought was starting to tip and become unbalanced. Now, the total time frame of Carl's experience was a month. He claimed that he exchanged souls with someone for a month. He had all these experiences. He described the clothing that he was wearing. He was sort of like, he wasn't high up in any sort of the society. He wasn't low down. He was sort of, like we'd have a local councilman or something like that. He described wearing this, like they'd wear long clothes that would go down to the ground of beautiful colours, these particular people. But while he was in this body, he had all types of experiences in society. But at the same time, his body here on Earth, which his best friend spent a lot of time with, was continuing as Carl. And he says here that, what does he say here? Then, approximately 1 month towards the end of his experience, he had the growing realisation that he wasn't who he thought he was on that world. And on the last evening, just as he was falling asleep, Carl had a sudden flash of realisation that he didn't belong in this world, and the next day he woke up and was back in his own bed here on Earth. Now, at first he thought he'd been experiencing an extremely long dream, but when he rang his friend to tell him what had happened, his friend told him that the few days before he called, the being inhabiting Carl's body told him the same thing.
Ooh.
Now, what happened was that Carl's friend went, I don't want to know you anymore. I don't know who you were the last month. You were not yourself. I don't know who you were. It scared the crap out of me. I'm out of here. And he just cut him off, basically. That's what happened.
Can't do it.
Yeah, and so Carl struggled with his experiences for quite a while. Well, that happened when he was 12, and he was 18 when he came here to tell us his experience. And for a long time he struggled with that after he'd told me that particular part of it, because what happened afterwards, he began to have psychic attacks. And he'd often feel a presence in the room, and then he'd be thrown around while feeling hands around his neck. And at various times he'd be pinned down on the floor by a visible force, and other times he'd have that experience and feel a hand over his mouth. And these attacks would occur 3 or 4 times per week, and sometimes this amount would occur in one day. The attacks were quite random, sometimes occurring for periods of time when nothing would happen for months, and they continued from age 12 to 18 when the attacks eventually stopped. Now, I've known him for a long time. I consider him a shaman. He would never call himself that. I don't think he would even consider him that, but I think that he had certainly had a shamanic initiation experience, that's for sure. He was a nurse at the time, working in the one hospital, like that. And was transferred to another out of the town, and where he lives now. He and his partner have a lot of UFO sightings. They've practiced calling in, doing the CE5 stuff, and then I might have told you this one time. He rang me and said, "We had this experience last night where this light became really close to the house, like." We went there one time, Barry and I went there, and it was only, I don't know, how far away from the house would it have been? 20 metres, something like that, I think.
About that,
Yeah. And he rang me and he said, "This light has shown up and it's in the trees near the house. What do I do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. You called him in. What are you going to do?" Tell him to go away. Go away. I don't know.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, exactly. So I freaked them out for a bit, but they've had really, really, good sightings there. So the sightings continue as far as I'm aware. I haven't spoken to him for about a year, 18 months or so. So that's his story. I consider him a very grounded, down-to-earth person, but extremely spiritual in his approach to life. He's certainly not an idiot, and I don't think he's deluded, but I do think has had unusual experiences. I don't have any reason to doubt him having that 1 month soul exchange experience. I just wanted to wind up with a quote from David Paladin. We need to move on to a new myth. The old stories are losing their relevance. We're taking quantum leaps and our paradigms are shifting rapidly.
That's amazing.
And I think that's...
Can only hope.
You can only hope. Yeah, well, I think, you know, paradigms are shifting.
I feel it.
Everyone, not paradigms, there are variations of many paradigms, and they're not all shifting at the same time. And that collision that's the challenge when they collide and they, you know, and it creates that imbalance. So I think, you know, like Barry and I through the whole last 3 years of just, like we've talked about, our little tribe is just living in a little bubble.
Send love and light to everybody.
Just live in your bubble, work with what you can, and you have to let the rest go to spirit or whatever it is. And I have said this once before, but when the pandemic started, I did a shamanic journey to, you know, what's going on, what's happening. But the basic message was, don't worry, Spirit's here, we've got your back. And they'd all shown up.
It's a necessary evil.
In, you know, gazillions, because we needed that support.
Yeah.
That's it, people.
Oh,
thank you.
Thanks for coming. We've gone a bit over time.
That was so
Hope you enjoyed the topic.
and fun.
Yeah.